Everyone, welcome back to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the TikTok divestment bill, Georgia's school choice bill, and Mike Pence. All right, so let's get to the TikTok bill that passed the House of Representatives. Many of you have probably already heard of this, but essentially what this bill does is it forces TikTok's Chinese owning company, ByteDance, to either sell the app or the company to an American company. So that would look like, selling it to a company like Microsoft, or the app would be banned in the United States. And the bill provides basically a 6-month window for this divestment to have to take place. And so a couple of things to point out here. First, when we say divestment, that means exactly what I just said. It means having to sell TikTok to an American company. That is different than an outright ban of the company itself. In other words, the owner, the ByteDance, the owners of TikTok, would still be able to profit from their company. They wouldn't be able to continue to profit, but they would be able to sell for however much money there would be the market would buy it for, and there would be a market for TikTok. This is a wildly successful and popular app, and so as a result, the owners of TikTok, ByteDance, would make a pretty penny, many billions of dollars, from an American company to buy this app. However, it is highly unlikely that they are going to do that. Now, let's kind of think about this for a second. First, the owners of TikTok are choosing and would rather choose, okay, and this has been I guess this is speculation at this point, because they could go through with the sell, but they have kind of announced that they are unwilling to sell TikTok. So they would rather shut down TikTok completely, make zero money from TikTok in the United States, which is their major market, $0 from TikTok, but are instead of selling it to an American company. That's, I think, speaks volumes to how they view TikTok. They don't necessarily view it as a business venture, right? And so why is this even an issue? Again, many of you have probably already thought about or heard about the arguments for this bill, but essentially the arguments, there's all sorts of different arguments. I'll tell you what I think is about this bill and what I think is the most convincing arguments for banning or forcing a divestment of TikTok. The first is simply data mining, that the Chinese government has access to data on millions, 100 million plus Americans, okay? So what this means is, and this is just a reality of a company that operates in China. In fact, not just any company, but this company in particular, every ounce and piece of data that ByteDance collects on its users is at the whims of being asked for and accessed by the Chinese Communist Party. Okay? Which means, and so, when people hear that, they kind of first have a couple of reactions to it, okay? And those who would be against banning of the app. Well, the first kind of reaction is, well, who cares if they have access to my data? First, okay, American companies already have access to all my data, okay? And that's a compelling point. And I mean, if we're going to be honest here, the big tech companies, social media companies like Meta and Twitter and whatever else, they do have an enormous amount of data on Americans, a huge store of data on Americans. And if you have one of those apps, or if you have a phone in general, then your data is accessed and possessed by these large tech companies. And so if that's true, well then who cares if the Chinese Communist Party has access to that data? So that's kind of the first reaction. And I understand that reaction, that data is data, so if one person has it, then who cares if another person has it? But the reality is, Meta and Twitter, these American companies, they have your data with the incentive to use that data in some capacity for profit, right? They want to make money off of your data. Now, we can have all sorts of different agreements or disagreements on whether that's okay or not, right? And in fact, we can, and there has been conversation about whether we should pass legislation to limit profiting off of data without, more explicit consent, for example. And so we can have that conversation, but it's and whether that's okay. But it's still true that an American company using data to for profit is a much different thing than the Chinese Communist Party using data for more sinister ends in a power competition with the United States. And so that is a categorical difference, right? The Chinese Communist Party potentially using data harmfully to harm Americans and harm American society and be detrimental to the country as a whole is a different categorical thing than Meta using data to profit, right? So I think those are just categorical differences there. The other kind of reaction is frequently, well, who cares if the Chinese Communist Party has access to my data of me watching TikTok dances or me watching cooking videos, or who really cares if they do, right? And again, it's a valid kind of thought, but it's not just your individual data that TikTok provides, the Chinese Communist Party, right? It is you are part of this 100 plus million American database that the Chinese Party can use to understand and then importantly influence American culture, right? And so here's what that means. The CCP doesn't just have access to what you're watching. They have access to in geo location. They have access to in some capacity your keyboard swipes. So what you're swiping on your keyboard, not just in the app itself, but outside the app. They have access to some biometrical data. They have all of this data, right? Of not just you, but of 100 plus million Americans. And then they had the ability to influence 100 plus million Americans using their algorithm and programming their algorithm in such a way to then influence Americans. And this was actually no better demonstrated than when they recently, as this bill was in committee, when they pushed a notification out to their users encouraging them to call their congressman and vote no on this bill, right? And so what you had is teenagers who were calling their congressmen and women demanding that they don't ban TikTok, threatening to kill themselves if they ban TikTok. Okay, if they're able to mobilize Americans in this and just using a notification that was obvious and blatant, how much more sinister could they influence Americans by tweaking with the algorithm some, right? That's a big deal, right? And again, that's different than they have the motivation to do that, right? They have the motivation to potentially do something like that because they're in this power struggle with the United States. Okay, that is inherently different than the motivation of Meta to just make money, right? We can argue that Meta uses detrimental ways of profiting, okay, but that's still a different thing than a foreign entity purposely using and being detrimental to Americans to weaken, to ruin, to harm the country as a whole and the people within the country. So I am in favor of this bill. I'm in favor of forcing TikTok to be divested. I would be in favor of legislation that limits social media in some capacity. I'm open to not just TikTok, but a ban of social media before you turn 18. Okay, that you can't actually download and be on social media websites until you turn 18. You can't have a social media account until you turn 18. And we can argue and quibble about the age, maybe 18, maybe 16, maybe 21, but then nonetheless, okay, some sort of and to really enforce that rule, I think that would be beneficial. Okay, that again is where I'm conservative and not necessarily libertarian. Where libertarians say, well, just kind of let people do whatever. I'm more open to. I think the government does have a role when something is this detrimental to its people. And this bill the vote was, and this is in a popular position, at least amongst Congress, which I think speaks volumes that Republicans and Democrats in this partisan, divided time that we live in are both, on board pretty much with this bill. And I think that speaks volumes to political realignment that we're seeing right now. So I think the Democratic Party is clearly more hawkish. And so, the Democratic Party, you can see that with funding Ukraine. You can see that in taking this tough stance against TikTok. So they're clearly more hawkish, at least than they have been in the past. And so what you see is this political realignment of Republican hawks who are still hawkish, aligning with this kind of increasingly hawkish Democratic Party. And so it's evident of a shifting political realignment that's happening. But it also, I think, speaks volumes to the information and that has been provided to the congressmen and women as they vote. Right? They were briefed by this different agencies about TikTok and how TikTok could be used against Americans. So they've been briefed. They have more information than we do regarding national security and how TikTok relates to that. And the overwhelming consensus is to force TikTok to divest. And when I say lopsided, the vote was 352 to 65. Okay, so that's a huge, huge vote. Okay, a huge margin there. And that's particularly important because Donald Trump and several Donald Trump's allies in Congress, Rand Paul, for example, allies outside of Congress, Vivek Ramaswamy, for example, they actually came out against this bill to force TikTok to be divested. And so in spite of Donald Trump, the leader of the Republican Party, coming out against this bill, Republicans in a huge swath still voted for it. So again, I think that speaks volumes to just how, of a bipartisan issue this really is. All right, moving on to another example of political realignment and political issues, particularly in the Republican Party. Mike Pence came out today on Fox, not today, but this week on Fox News, and said that he would not be supporting Donald Trump for president. I have the quotation here. He says, quote, "It should come as no surprise that I will not be endorsing Donald Trump this year. He is pursuing and articulating an agenda that is at odds with the conservative agenda we governed on during our 4 years. And that is why I cannot in good conscience endorse Donald Trump." Okay, so Mike Pence, again, former vice president of Donald Trump, and it really has been anathema in the Republican Party since his unwillingness to overturn the 2020 election. And Mike Pence has been, I would argue, up until the very moment that he was asked to break his constitutional oath, Mike Pence has been one of, if not the most loyal, supporters of Donald Trump. He was his running mate. He was his vice president. And so Mike Pence, during the 4 years that he was a part of the administration, was constantly supporting Donald Trump, was constantly defending Donald Trump, and even in situations where he probably and likely did disagree with Donald Trump, didn't say a word. Okay, Mike Pence was really crucial in evangelical Christians getting on board with the Trump campaign in 2016. If people forget this because evangelicals support Donald Trump en masse now, but Donald Trump was one of his weakest points of support, groups of support in the Republican primary in 2016, was amongst evangelical Christians. And the reason being because Donald Trump is a terrible person and has been a terrible person and has a track record of being a terrible character, of having terrible character. And evangelical Christians back in 2016 still cared about that kind of thing. And so he was not liked. There was also questions about what he would do with the abortion issue. Okay, he wasn't screaming pro-life positions like some of the other candidates, and so he was not popular amongst evangelical Christians. That is really until a couple of things happened. Number one, the Supreme Court justice, the list of Supreme Court justices that he would choose from, the pool of people he would choose from in a potential Supreme Court opening was full of originalist conservative justices. Okay, that is largely because, I would argue, the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society has been around since the 80s, and they, for the longest time, have handed Republican candidates list of people that they should nominate, and Republicans have done that. And I think that's what happened in 2016. Donald Trump knew that he needed to get these conservative legal people on board, and so he went with what the Federalist Society told him. So that was the first thing. But the second thing, and this brings us back to what I'm talking about now, is Mike Pence joining the ticket. Mike Pence, again, things change in 8 years, but Mike Pence, before 2016, was seen as one of the most conservative members of the Republican Party. He was a governor of Indiana, and a very conservative governor of Indiana. He was a representative. He was part of the House Freedom Caucus. He was a conservative. He's proven to be pro-life and championed the pro-life cause for decades. He's championed conservative principles for decades. And so when he joined the ticket in 2016, Republicans, evangelical Christian Republicans, felt a sense of ease with voting for Donald Trump. They had this candidate, Hillary Clinton, who was awful in their eyes. They had this uncertainty in Donald Trump, but they had this certain conservative, Mike Pence, that they knew, he can influence Donald Trump. And if Trump's willing to pick him as my running candidate, then maybe he's more conservative than we thought. And so Mike Pence, the evangelical Christian person who really pushed and garnered evangelical Christian support for Donald Trump, is now a traitor to the party, is now a traitor to the conservative cause, is now a rhino, is now disloyal. Why? All because he refused to stand up to Donald Trump. He did stand up to Donald Trump, and he refused to overturn the election in 2020. And now that man, loyal for 4 years, that man, conservative, that man who's been fighting the conservative fight for decades, is now not supporting Donald Trump. Now, you could see that, and you could say, shame on him. You could say, his ego, his pride. You could say that he needs to sacrifice that for the good of the country. Doesn't he know that the good of the country is at stake? Doesn't he know that this is the most important election of our lifetime? Doesn't he know that Joe Biden's America is going 4 more years of Joe Biden's America is going to ruin this country? And I want to make clear that he came out in that same interview and said that he would never vote for Joe Biden. So he's not voting for Joe Biden, but he's also not voting for Donald Trump. And so, does it speak to Mike Pence's character that he won't vote for Donald Trump? Or does it speak to Donald Trump's character? And I would argue, by far, it speaks to Donald Trump's character. In fact, it's not just Mike Pence. Over and over and over and over again, the people who were in the Trump administration, the people who worked most closely with Donald Trump, I'm thinking of people like John Bolton, I'm thinking of people like Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, UN Ambassador John Bolton to George Bush, but then National Defense Secretary, I believe, is what John Bolton's position was in the cabinet. High-level officials who worked closely with Donald Trump, all coming out and saying, no, I refuse, I can't, in good conscience, support Donald Trump. Again, conservatives, if this doesn't speak volumes to Donald Trump, to his philosophy, governing philosophy, to his competency, and to his character, then I don't know what else can. These aren't leftists, media types. These aren't MSNBC commentators. These aren't Democrats. These are lifelong Republicans, conservative, fighting the conservative cause, and for a long time were so conservative to be radical to those leftists and Democrats. These are the people coming out and saying they cannot support Donald Trump. Okay, at some point we have to listen. Okay, at some point we should listen. At some point we should take them at their word. And maybe they're not all, rhinos and swamp monsters, and they just hate that Donald Trump drained the swamp, which he didn't do. At some point we have to take them at their word. And I think Mike Pence, being an exile, being an being ostracized in the Republican Party today speaks way more about the Republican Party and the state of the Republican Party than about Mike Pence. And so I think that this should be, it won't be, but it should be a time to look in the mirror as Republicans and say, maybe we should do something different. That's a good segue, actually, to what I want to talk about next, which is David French, a piece he had in the New York Times. Okay, David French, speaking of people who are ostracized by MAGA, David French is a columnist at the New York Times now. He has previously worked for the Dispatch. He's previously worked for National Review. He's a Iraq War veteran, Harvard graduate, a lawyer. Was a pro-life advocate for a long time. So David French is hated by MAGA largely because in 2016 he refused to back Donald Trump and has been outspoken in his opposition to Donald Trump since the very beginning. By many, he's seen as soft. By many, he's seen as too weak. I think very highly of David French. I think he's a very principled person. I have my disagreements with David French. But nonetheless, what I like about David French is that he makes me think. Because a lot of times, or sometimes, I disagree with him. And this piece in the New York Times, I think, was really interesting. So the headline is, Why Haley Supporters Should Turn to Biden, Not Trump. Okay, so again, this is someone who is a conservative in a lot of ways. He has been he was a lifelong Republican until Donald Trump. He's a pro-life advocate, small government, limited government, almost libertarian type, pretty close to libertarian type actually. He is saying that Haley supporters, those who supported Nikki Haley, should actually support Joe Biden in the next election, not Donald Trump. Now, I just talked about how I don't think conservatives should vote for Donald Trump. If I haven't made that clear yet, I will continue to make that clear today and in weeks in the future. But what David French here is not just saying don't vote for Donald Trump, right? He's saying actually support Joe Biden. Okay, and so I want to read some quotations from this. He says, quote, "The reality is that Haley voters need to understand that the Republican Party is sprinting away from them. It's sprinting away from the Reagan conservative heritage and from the ideologies and beliefs of Haley Republicans." Okay, so David French there is making the claim that MAGA, that the Republican Party, as it becomes more MAGAfied, is running away from Reagan conservatives, which he is using Haley supporters to kind of symbolize Reagan conservatives. And at this point, I 100% agree with David French. In fact, this is one of my biggest concerns in 2024, is that these Reagan conservatives, these people who believe in the three-legged stool of conservatism, strong national defense, fiscal conservatism, fiscal responsibility, and religious liberty, but social conservatism. Okay, so you have strong national defense, you have social conservatism, and fiscal conservatism or restraint. Those three things for a long time were the three-legged stool of the conservative movement. I would kind of add in. I think that is a decent analogy, but it doesn't kind of encompass the conservative movement. I would add in people. People who cared about like originalism and legal conservatism as kind of a big pillar as well. Which again I would fall under, which David French would fall under, which many Reaganites would fall under, and so that conservatism that was symbolized. That was that Ronald Reagan was an emblem of. That conservatism, David French is arguing, is no longer to be found in the Republican Party. It's to be found there. I guess it's probably to be found there. He'd say that. It's still to be found there some. But that the Republican Party as a whole, that the people that matter in the Republican Party, is running away from that type of conservatism. And again, to that point, I completely agree with David French. So my worry with 2024 is that those Reagan conservatives that supported Donald Trump in 2016 largely because he was the worst, or the better of two evils. And then for 4 years, he, in a lot of ways, does rule and does his administration was a rather Reagan conservative administration, between the judicial nominees, between passing a tax bill. In a lot of ways, was also more of a hawk than he is, saying he is now. But even with like how he dealt with ISIS, okay, that was in strong national defense. Okay, so. And he differed in some ways, particularly free trade amongst them. But nonetheless, he in a lot of ways over the course of 4 years, he did. His administration was a rather Reagan conservative administration. But, and this is my concern, is that people will see his first 4 years as what the next 4 years are going to be like if Donald Trump is president. Now, I hope I'm wrong, right? I'm not one of those people that, I hope that I can, brag about how I was right about Donald Trump. I hope I am wrong, and I hope Donald Trump is Reagan incarnated in 2024 and beyond, okay, if he wins. I hope he his whole presidency is one of Reagan conservatism. I would love nothing more, right? So I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. I think that his next 4 years are not going to be kind to Reagan conservatism. The reason I say that is because I think in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump in 2016, in 2020, 2024, Donald Trump, probably until the end of time, does not understand policy, does not know policy. Okay? Let's just be frank about that. He is not one of those people, has never been accused of being one of those people, has never said he's one of those people that like gets into the nitty-gritty policy details, right? That's fine. Okay, you don't have to be that. In a lot of ways, Ronald Reagan wasn't necessarily that, although Ronald Reagan did his homework, okay? And so you don't have to be in the nitty-gritty of the policy details. What you have to have, though, is a coherent, I would argue, preferably conservative governing philosophy. You have to have some principles, okay, and then you can evaluate the data and evaluate different policy positions based on your guiding principle and your governing philosophy. Donald Trump didn't have that. Donald Trump doesn't have that. But what Donald Trump did have in 2016 was a Republican Party who had that, was a Republican infrastructure that had that. I use the example of the Federalist Society. Okay, the Federalist Society, again, been around since the 80s, had a coherent and has a coherent, strong philosophy regarding legal interpretation and legal theory, one of originalism. Okay, and so they have the Republican Party for a long time, like I mentioned, has kind of outsourced their judicial nominees to the Federalist Society. I would argue as rightfully so, right? They have these ideas. They have these principles of constitutional limited government. They have these ideals of judicial restraint, these ideals of interpreting the law for what it says, not for what you want it to mean, right? They have these governing principles, and then the Federalist Society comes along and says, we agree with those principles, and we actually have names of people and lists of people, and are putting together an organization that you can pick from of people who agree with you and agree with these principles. Great, okay. But this is true not just of legal conservatism. This was true in 2016 and in other areas. Paul Ryan's a great example. Okay, that tax bill that Donald Trump passed, that tax bill was largely the result of Paul Ryan. Okay, Paul Ryan was one of those policy nerds. Okay, Paul Ryan was one of those, in the weeds of policy. Paul Ryan loved that stuff. And Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House at the time that the bill was passed, had been working on a budget, been working on a tax code revamp and revision for a long time. Not only that, but Paul Ryan was also really the last serious member of Congress who was looking for entitlement reform. So Paul Ryan knew policy. And that tax bill was the product of Paul Ryan. Okay? So what I think you had in 2016 and 2020 is, largely speaking, the conservative institutions, the Republican Party institutions that had been established over the course of decades, using Trump as a conduit to enact their conservative policies. And Trump largely went along with them, and credit to him for doing that, right? But what you have in 2024, and since 2020, because a lot of those people, once they worked for Donald Trump, left and said no more, hence Paul Ryan, hence the Rex Tillerson, hence John Bolton, hence, okay, etc. So they not only decided no more while they were part of the administration, But since 2020, and especially since his antics in 2020 and basically trying to steal the 2020 election, a lot of those institutions and those people who were worth having in government said, no, I refuse. And so now what I think you're going to have in 2024 is a Trump presidency that looks nothing like Reagan conservatism. Okay, so I say all that to say, I think David French here is right. That Reagan conservatives don't even realize how far the Republican Party has left them. Mainly because they're not in the news all the time, right? Most Americans, especially Reagan conservatives who, care about other stuff than politics, haven't been paying attention to what Donald Trump has been saying, to what the Republican Party has been saying, to what the Republican Party, the direction that it's going. And so they don't realize. And so that's my fear in 2024 is many of those Reagan conservatives will vote for Donald Trump thinking another 4 years of what they got in 2016 and 2020 to be disappointed, okay? Or change their views, which I think is actually more damaging, is to just change your views and think, well, I've kind of always believed this, okay? So I think David French is right here. But again, his argument is that therefore, okay, we should turn to Biden, and that's what I just disagree with. And again, I have a lot of respect for David French, but I just don't think I can get there with him, and I'll explain as we keep going. So, but I want to kind of build up David French's case. So, why is Biden, for Reagan conservatives, according to David French, why is Biden better than Trump? Okay, so he lists a couple of reasons. The first, law and order. Okay, the first, foreign policy. And this I kind of spoke to earlier. Biden has largely been more hawkish, right? He's been more hawkish, especially in Ukraine, right? A lot of people in the Republican Party, Donald Trump in particular, has been anti-giving money to Ukraine, anti-funding Ukraine. Now, again, we can argue about the whether that's good use of funds, whether it's not good use of funds. I tend to think that it is a good use of funds. I support continuing to fund Ukraine, and I think the Reagan conservatism of the 80s, going into the 90s and 2000 aughts, I think it's coherent to believe in funding Ukraine. Again, not putting boots on the ground, not going to war with Russia, but simply funding Ukraine. Okay, it's weakening Russia, etc. So because Democrats have been better on this issue, they're more hawkish. Okay, better on foreign policy. In one regard, yes, right? I do think in a lot of ways the Democratic Party is more hawkish. Okay, so I think David French is largely correct here. I do think he kind of undermines Afghanistan. I guess I understand why. Trump had desire to leave Afghanistan and withdraw as well, and so Trump presidency wouldn't have looked different in terms of policy. Maybe the execution would have been different. And so if we're kind of calling that a draw, then in a lot of ways Biden has been better on foreign policy, but still not good, right? And even David French kind of acknowledges that still not as good as it could be, but still better than the alternative, right? Okay, so that's the number one, better on foreign policy. Second, a law and order. Okay, he writes, this is David French, quote, between 2019 and 2020, America experienced the largest single-year increase in the murder rate in more than a century, and that was under Donald Trump. He continues, in 2023, on the other hand, the number of murders in U.S. cities fell by more than 12%. It was the biggest national decline on record, and violent crime right now is near its lowest levels in 50 years. Okay, so he argues that Biden has been better on law and order because we see these statistical differences under Trump. The murder rate increases, the largest single-year increase in more than a century, and then on the other hand, number of murders in U.S. cities has fallen under Biden, and violent crime right now is at its lowest level. Now, I don't like using the president kind of as a metric for things like this. In my opinion, the president doesn't have a lot to do with a lot of this. A lot of this is done by local prosecutors, cultural things. So, for example, in 2020, you had a pandemic, people at home, people going crazy, and you had a spike in crime, right? Is that Trump's fault? Is that the president's fault? Probably not, right? I would argue no. At the other hand, okay, you have those numbers declining. Is that because Biden is better? Probably not, right? So here, I think I just don't think Biden's been that much better. I don't think either really has that much control over the issue. And so I'm sitting here like, am I still, do I think Biden's been better? Probably not. Maybe. I don't know. Does the president even control it? If not, then is this really a point in Biden's favor, as French kind of seems to present? And I would argue, no, I don't really think it's a point in Biden's favor, okay? But, and here's the last one, okay? Here's the last thing. And this is really where I disagreed with David French. He talks about abortion, okay? And again, let me remind everyone that David French is very pro-life. I'm not accusing David French of being not being pro-life, and David French is in a lot of ways looking beyond the law to be pro-life. So he's not just pro-life in accordance with the law. He's pro-life, he wants abortion rates to go down, okay? That's his big thing, okay? So he's looking at abortion rates, and here's what he writes, okay? This is David French again. Donald Trump, failed from a pro-life perspective on the most important metric of all. For the first presidency since Jimmy Carter, the abortion rate actually increased. Yes, increased under Donald Trump. Barack Obama was a pro-choice president, but during his 2 terms, the abortion rate decreased by 28%. Continues, by contrast, the abortion rate went up in 2018, in 2019, and 2020 under Trump. And that is a record that should trouble pro-life Americans. Even if you can't lay all of that on Donald Trump's feet, this is a very complex phenomenon. It was a remarkable change from the previous decades before Trump's presidency. Okay? So David French looks at abortion, this issue that he cares deeply about, that many Reagan conservatives care deeply about, that Christians care deeply about. And he says if we look at abortion rates, which in his eyes is the metric that we should judge how we're doing in our fight against abortion. How many abortions are actually being, what's the abortion rate? How many people are actually having an abortion, right? And he says that number went down during Barack Obama's tenure, and then went up for the first time under Donald Trump. Okay? So, is that Trump's fault, right? And he even acknowledges, we can't lay this all at Donald Trump's feet. Okay? But I just think there's a difference in the abortion rate plummeting or increasing, either one, kind of due to multi-factor things. Not just the president. It can be cultural. It can be economic. It can be so many other factors than simply who the president is. That is just different as a way to measure a politician's success and stance on abortion than a politician openly supporting the killing of babies. Whether the abortion rate went down or has gone down under Biden, I don't know. But he and his administration is in favor of the killing of babies. Kamala Harris, this past week, went to an abortion clinic and spoke to support abortion. I simply cannot, this is where I disagree with David French, I cannot get behind that kind of politician. That is my line in the sand. I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump. I've been clear about that. But I don't think you, as a Christian, as a pro-lifer, can vote for Biden. I just don't see how you can, if that issue really matters to you. If it doesn't, okay, I can see how you can talk yourself into it. But if that issue matters, and I would argue to the vast majority of Reagan conservatives, to the vast majority of Christians, it does matter. If that issue matters, I simply don't think you can vote for Joe Biden in 2024. So this is where I disagree with David French. Okay, I don't think you can. I won't. And again, this is someone I respect. That's why I wanted to talk so much about this piece, because I do respect David French and I respect his ideas. But I simply, when we're thinking about 2024 and who to vote for, we have on one hand Donald Trump, a person of beyond flawed moral character, a person who tried to steal the last election, a person who I would argue in a lot of ways isn't even conservative, and in recent years has walked further and further away from conservatism. On the other hand, you have Biden, who, and this is why I like the David French piece, is he's starting to acknowledge has some conservative policies, such as foreign policy, which is a big one. In a lot of ways doesn't, but does have that. So we're faced with these two options. Not good options. Who should we vote for? Can we justify voting for one or the other? And again, I still think no. I think, as I will do, I think everyone should write in, should leave it blank, whatever it takes. I don't know. Does that mean one of them will still win? Yes, but I simply don't think that we can write in their name of these two people who are such bad options, right? And I just wasn't convinced by David French's piece that nonetheless we should vote for Biden. Georgia School Choice Bill. Okay, so Georgia Promise Scholarship Act was passed in the Georgia House of Representatives this past week. And this is SB 233, so a little history, and this is what I wrote my newsletter on this week, little history behind this bill. This was the bill that passed the Georgia Senate last year, which was a huge deal because this was the first school choice bill in really Georgia's legislative history that passed any house of Congress, okay? So it passed the Senate, which is a big deal. Once it passes the Senate, it's got to go to then the House to be passed. And once it passed the Senate, you had this push, right? This was the moment we're going to get this through. Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, comes out and supports this thing. The first governor who hadn't just remained neutral on the issue becomes out a supporter of this bill, and it doesn't pass. Okay, it doesn't pass the House. All right. Well, now this year, it does pass the House. Okay. The major obstacle, the reason why it didn't pass last year, it's now passed. So this is a really big deal. Okay, it still has to go through the Senate. It still has to go and be signed by the governor. But hopefully it will, because it already did last year. Okay, and so what exactly is this bill? That's a little bit of background. What exactly is this bill? Okay, so what this bill does is it allows Georgia, the state of Georgia, to create promise scholarships. These are going to be worth $6,500 per year per student. Okay, that $6,500 will be given to families in the form of an educational savings account, okay, an ESA. That's kind of the colloquial word for it. So the government will give families $6,500. The families can then withdraw that money from their ESA account and spend it on approved educational material. Okay, so some of the approved education expenses are things like private school tuition, things like homeschooling materials, things like tutoring services, okay, etc. So and there's other things that it can go towards as well. And so this is a really big win for the school choice movement. Okay, however. Again, before I kind of go on, I say this in the piece, before I go on and complain about the bill, this is a great bill. Very glad it passed. Hope it passes. This makes school choice better in Georgia. This will improve the lives of Georgia families. This is a good bill, okay? And people should have voted for this bill and should vote for this bill, okay? This is a good bill. I want to make that clear, that I'm not criticizing the bill. This is a bill that was passed in the way that it was passed, because it had to be passed that way in order to actually pass, okay? Good to go further, like I want, to broaden school choice wasn't realistic. Because it wasn't realistic, get what you can get, right? So, again, great bill. However, it doesn't go far enough, okay? And this is my call to the school choice movement in Georgia. Keep going, to push further, okay? And so what do I mean that it doesn't go far enough? Well, the first thing, really, the limitations that it places on the people who are eligible for these funds is where I have most of my issues. So the first limitation is kind of a pretty standard one, which, the limitation is what it is. I don't love the limitation. I wish it didn't exist, but I at least understand the thinking behind it, and it's not that impactful that it's going to make things that, worse or anything like that. So the first limitation is that a parent's income cannot exceed 400% of the federal poverty level. So for a family of four, that's around $120,000. Okay, so you have to be under that $120,000 for a family of four, or the 4 times the federal income level. Okay, poverty level. So that's the first. So it's geared towards lower income. The second limitation, and this is the one that I hope is expanded one day, is that the student must be enrolled in a Georgia public school that has been in the bottom 25% of public schools for 2 consecutive years, according to Georgia's College and Career Readiness Performance Index, the CCRPI. Okay, so A student, in order to be eligible for this $6,500, must be enrolled in a public school or zoned for a public school that is in the bottom 25% in Georgia. Okay, so why? Again, glad that those students qualify, but this needs to go further. And why does it need to go further? Because first, I believe in school choice for the reason of freedom, right? Parents ought to make the best decision, be able to make the best decision for their child. They pay property tax that already goes to the public school. Okay? It's already bad enough that if they send their kid elsewhere, they have to continue to pay that property tax. So I think it's only right that if they're not using the public school, that they get some sort of money in return. Not only that, but so the freedom aspect of it. The second aspect is I think school choice works. Okay, it increases competition, which forces schools to be better. Okay, if you're not good, then students are going to leave. You're going to lose resources, and then so in order to incentivize people to stay, that you're going to be as good as you can be. So I think it incentivizes competition. It improves quality of education. Also, because I think it's school choice helps those in poverty in particular. If you're stuck in a failing school, then you should be able to leave that failing school. Okay? Especially if there's one, which typically there is one close by within driving distance that isn't failing. Okay, so those are why I'm in favor of school choice in general. I think everyone should have it. Okay, but there's particular issues with it only being, in this case, limited to the bottom 25% of schools. The first is that there are going to be schools that are still failing, according to the CCRPI, that are not within the bottom 25% of public schools. So that means a student could be in a failing public school and yet not qualify for this money. Okay, I think that's just wrong. Okay, not only that, but you have to be enrolled for 2 consecutive years, or the school has to have failed for 2 consecutive years, and you have to be enrolled in that school. So what that means is there could be a school that fails for 1 year, that has failing scores, that is in the bottom 25% in 1 year, and a student will have to remain enrolled in that school. That school would then have to fail again, then that student will qualify. Okay? Again, I just think that's wrong. And so what they should do, okay, and then again, glad they passed it, glad it did pass, but in future legislative sessions, what I hope they focus on is expanding this, okay? And this is why I think this was a good bill to begin with, because it's it's harder to establish a system like this, to start it, than it is to expand it. Okay, so now it's been started. This bill starts it, assuming it passes. Okay, the Senate and the governor signs it. So it's been passed. It's been started. Now let's expand it, and one way to do that is to take off that limitations that a student must be in the bottom 25% of public schools in the state. All right, now I want to talk about a book that I finished recently. This is a well-known book, War and Peace, okay, by Leo Tolstoy. By many, War and Peace is considered the greatest novel of all time. It is a behemoth of a book. The edition that I was reading, I think it's over here somewhere, but it was and is 1,200 pages long of, not big font. And I just have some thoughts. Okay, I want to talk about this. Did I like it? I kind of, as I was reading it, once I finished it, kept asking myself that question: did I like it? And to be frank, I don't know. There were some parts that I thought were enjoyable. There were some parts I thought were really good. And then there were other parts that I simply did not want to keep reading and did not care to keep reading. I did not even think were good. Because it's a long book, you do get to know the characters pretty well, but for how long the book is and for how many years you're tracking these characters in their lives, I still don't feel like the characters were that developed. They could have been significantly more developed than they were. And then you have some of these main characters, Pierre Bezukhov being one of the main characters here, and Pierre is a guy who's in a lot of ways naive. He is not with the society of Russia, meaning he doesn't necessarily play nice and do the sort of platitudes that society in Russia demands. He's after the meaning of life. is really what he's kind of pursuing this whole book. He looks at it and looks for it in all sorts of different places. And spoilers if you haven't read it. You can skip this if you like, but he at the end kind of comes to an understanding of the purpose of life in his mind. It's some form of simplicity, but that's not really even fleshed out, I don't think, as much as it could be. He definitely changes and starts to live a life that is not one of kind of rampant indulgence like he previously did. So there's clearly a change. And so he clearly thinks that he has, by the end of the novel, found something real and found what he's after and has found satisfaction in that. But when you're reading it, it's kind of confusing what that is. It deals with simplicity in some regard, but I'm not quite sure that it's as fleshed out as it could have been. And I wish it had been more fleshed out. Andrei Bolkonsky is another of the main characters. And I really like in a lot of ways. He is very analytical, very rational. And because of that, he struggles with opening up to people. He struggles with a kind of allowing himself emotionally to be attached to people. He becomes very cynical at one point and almost nihilistic. And he does change in the novel, and towards the end, again, spoiler, but he will eventually die, and it's a moving scene of him dying, a moving drama that unfolds, but again, at the end, he reaches this point where he almost realizes that he kind of lets go of all the things of this life that he cared about. And Tolstoy does kind of elucidate that a little bit, but just doesn't, again, flesh it out like I want him to. What I actually think the best character in the novel, Natasha, who I just think is the most interesting of the characters, because she begins kind of as this really naive young girl who is a child, is very childlike, and she understands, I would argue, very little about the world, and doesn't necessarily even seem to think about the world a whole lot. And then she grows up, falls in love, is very emotional in a lot of ways, is very impulsive in a lot of ways, grows up, is proposed to by Andrei Bolkonsky, and is in love with him, and then goes on this just nonsensical scene. And I mean nonsensical, I mean it actually makes a lot of sense if you're human, right? But nonsensical in that it's irrational. This guy begins to, this real player, this real womanizer, begins to give her attention and basically will convince her to run away with him and elope, breaking off the marriage with Andrei. And she's prevented from doing this. And then, as she realizes what she did, is distraught and repentant, and is in a lot of ways broken by this incident. But out of that brokenness, finds Christ, finds religion, the kind of Orthodox religion of Russian culture at that time, and is kind of rebuilt at that point. Once she kind of realizes and experiences the love of Christ, is rebuilt after this brokenness that has taken place in her because of her own nonsensical decisions. Then she becomes, because she's being rebuilt by this by Christ's love, becomes this very, I think, admirable character in a lot of ways. And so I think her kind of venture through the novel, I think is the most interesting. I think it's the most in depth. Like, she really does go through some stuff, and doesn't her transformation, it makes more sense, I think, than the other ones. And then you just have these sections throughout the book of war, right? And the details of wars that I just didn't necessarily care about, and maybe some people do. Maybe some people love that historical fiction part of it. Maybe if I understood the war and knew the wars better, I would be more a fan of them. But I just thought they were not interesting. They were dry. I think that in a lot of ways Tolstoy was using the war as a change mechanism, meaning that when Andrei goes to war, he's very ambitious and very pie in the sky and idealistic of becoming, receiving glory and earning glory in war, and then he's faced with war and it changes him, right? In one scene, Pierre goes to observe the battle, is even held once the French take over Moscow. He stays, wants to assassinate Napoleon, doesn't, and becomes a prisoner. And so there, and then he experiences a change in prison. And so the war as kind of and the thing that changes, a force of change in a novel, I understand. But I just think Tolstoy could have done that without the intense detail. And again, maybe if I knew the wars better, I would care more about. And that's a huge chunk of the novel. It's not just one section. It's throughout the novel. He's going into in-depth detail, and he kind of does that, which brings me to the last thing I kind of want to talk about with this book is his ideas of history. Now, I'm kind of in favor. I don't mind if an author kind of interjects and throws in his opinion and his ideas. In this instance, it's Tolstoy talking about history and how history is really just a predetermined thing that goes on, right? And this idea of great men and people change history is really only the reality. Is only that way because historians look back, okay, kind of see what has inevitably happened, and point to and make individual characters in the story of history, point them out as agents of great historical matter, right? That they didn't actually cause anything to happen, but rather historians look back and pick them as historical actors and great historical figures. And I think Napoleon is obviously the best example of this in the novel, where Napoleon is he is seen by historians as this great figure who changed history. And yet throughout the novel, again and again, Tolstoy takes note of how, no, he actually didn't really do anything of substance to cause any change. Rather, it was going to inevitably happen, and he just happened because of external things that he couldn't control, but he just happened to do what he did. And then things just happened as they did. And that's his kind of view of history. And, okay, that's an interesting view. I don't necessarily, care. I don't say care, but I just don't think thinking of life as this inevitable thing that happens and will continue to happen in history as inevitably unraveling the way that it does is worth thinking about, because then you lose your locus of control from, being internal to external, and psychological studies have shown that when you have a locus of control that's external to you, you think that what happens to you is just going to happen, you don't have any control over it. That is terrible for us, because as humans, we aren't meant to live that way. Again, whether it is true or not, we aren't meant to think and live as if it is true, right? Even if we, and this is kind of where I would even, let's say Tolstoy is right, okay? Okay, so let's say that all and everything that happens is inevitable and that everything is predetermined. Okay, if we were to live like that and to ponder that and as a result live as if that's true, our lives will be worse off and we will be more miserable. Whereas if we either convince ourselves it's not true because we can make arguments that oppose it, or we, in a sense, convince ourselves and tell ourselves that even if that's true, it doesn't matter because we need a sense of control. I think that is, in a lot of ways, a helpful way of thinking. That, okay, there are things we can't control, but convincing ourselves that there are things we can control, there are decisions we can make, is a healthy way of living. I mean, I think the Bible talks about this. The Bible, in a sense that God is sovereign over everything, but at the same time, we are told to do stuff, right? And when we're told to do stuff, when God commands us to do stuff, when we are called to live lives of righteousness, we need to think about those things as if they're things that we can actually do, or we'll be worse off. And I think we won't be living as God has called us to live. So I know there's a long-winded kind of musing on War and Peace, but it's a long book, and took me several months to finish. And I'm, still thinking through it, as you can tell, but I wanted to think through it kind of live on the mic, so that's what I did. All right, now let's end with a quotation of the week, and I thought this was fitting that it comes from War and Peace. So it's from Tolstoy, but he says, quote, "A good commander not only does not need genius or any special qualities, but, on the contrary, he needs the absence of the best and highest human qualities: love, poetry, tenderness, a searching philosophical doubt. He should be limited, firmly convinced that what he is doing is very important. Otherwise, he would not have patience enough, and only then will he be a brave commander. God forbid he should be a human being and come to love or pity someone, or start thinking about what is just and what isn't." The reason I wanted to use this quotation and talk about it briefly was simply because there is a sense in which a commander in a battle is, war is a very worldly thing. There will not be war in heaven, for example. So it's a very worldly thing. And so to be good at something that is this worldly in war, you have to be worldly, right? And I don't mean that necessarily immorally. You don't have to be immoral, but you have to be concerned with the things of this world. And so, what Tolstoy is saying here is someone who is concerned about metaphysical things, concerned about things not concrete, not in the here and now, and that they're faced with right now. So things like love and poetry and pity, right? Someone who is focused on those things is not going to be a good commander because they're not focused on the task at hand. Whereas a good commander, according to Tolstoy, isn't focused on those things. And so I think what that kind of communicates is this idea that to be truly human isn't to be really good at the things of this world, right? But it's to be good at those things and to be shaped and molded by those things that are more real than this world, right? They're not outside of this world because they're present in this world, but they're more real than this world itself. And so when we're concerned with things like love and pity and beauty, when we're concerned with those things, I think we become more human, okay? Because we will be more human than we are now when we're in the presence of God. And in that presence, these are the kind, we'll be awestruck by the beauty of God. We'll be consumed by the love of God. These are the things that in our, perfect form we will be concerned with. We won't be concerned with things of this world like war in Tolstoy's instance here. So I think that's something to ponder this week. So with that, that's the end of the podcast this week. Thanks for joining. Please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide, and I hope to see you again next week.